of people, and a number of people have written this and said, well, now wait a minute, why in June of '72, when it looks like Nixon is going to beat McGovern, who was the Democratic nominee, or looked like he was going to be the nominee, why take a risk like this? But it was set in motion much earlier, and if you look at the detailed record, and believe me, it is voluminous, Nixon was looking for dirt on the opposition. There was something about Richard Nixon that his life, in a way, was a quest for the mail or the telephone conversations, the secrets of the opposition.
We have to take a quick break. A lot more coming up right here. Bob Woodward, Carl Bernstein. Watergate wasn't all that glamorous. We'll tell you why right after this.
Dropped to nothing. Nixon guaranteed the renomination. The Post is stuck with his story no one else wants. It'll sink the goddamn paper. Everyone says, get off it, Ben, and I come on very sage and I say, well, you'll see, you wait till this bottoms out. But the truth is, I can't figure out what we've got.
Jason Robards as Ben Bradley. Watergate has been romanticized and glamorized, and this notion that you two just sort of fell into this story, it was all so clean and easy. There's a book out by Michael Schudson called Watergate in America Memory. And Len Downey, who's now the executive editor of the Washington Post, was asked about Watergate. He said, we felt small. We did not feel big and powerful. Our responsibilities were huge to us. We didn't really believe the president was going to resign. Most of us were dysfunctional the night that he resigned. It was a small group of people at the Washington Post doing this. That's still what this business is all about. That's still what makes a difference. That's a lesson of Watergate I want to remind people about. It's hard. It was not glamorous. And at the time, it was dirty. People were sleeping. People weren't showering. People were not sleeping. Bernstein's desk was a mess. He and Woodward were fighting all the time. They were fighting with their editors. They were fighting with each other. They were all under such great pressure, it was difficult to figure out what was going on.
That's right. And one of the things that occurred in Watergate, when we found out that it really was going to unravel, we went to Bradley's house in the middle of the night to tell him about this. And when we laid out some of the details to him, he said, he didn't make a quip, he didn't make a joke. He said, what the hell do we do now? Because the way this information was piling up, you could not even forecast in any reasonable way what the ramifications were, where it went next. We were dealing with pieces of data. We didn't have Nixon's tapes. We didn't have testimony. We had little pieces, secretaries saying documents had been shredded.
This was a very incremental thing. We covered it a little bit at a time. We wrote more than 150 stories between the time and the break. Because real reporting takes a long time. And one of the things that you see in both Iran-Contra or in what happened during the Clinton administration is those stories broke as a result of federal investigators or as a result of somebody just throwing something out there as a fait accompli. This was a little bit at a time.
And we were in a different news environment. We could work on a story for a day, and if it wasn't ready, we could hold it. We held stories for a week or 2 weeks. There were very few reporters working on the story. There was not the pressure of the 24-hour news cycle. What's MSNBC have, what CNBC have, what CNN have? That did not exist.
But put yourself in the shoes of your editor, Ben Bradley. Kay Graham says, she said to him, if this is such a hell of a story, where is everybody else? Why is no one else doing it? Two untested local reporters coming in day after day with all this information. Your editors were pretty nervous with you, weren't they?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
And the fateful day when you reported that Hugh Sloan, the Nixon aide, had told a grand jury about a slush fund, a payoff fund of $300,000.
And that we actually wrote that Sloan, who's the treasurer of the Nixon re-election committee, had told the grand jury that Haldeman, who was Nixon's chief of staff, controlled this fund. This was the big story. We were wrong.
You saw Sloan come out on television and say, the story is not true. How was your stomach that day?
I think it's probably the lowest moment of our lives. I mean, we talked about resigning. It was clear.
You talked about resigning?
We did.
Oh, sure.
We
with
did.
each other and with the editors?
No,
with
among
each other. It clearly, we had made a mistake. They would never have come out and attacked us the way, substantively.
But how wrong were you?
It took us more than 24 hours to figure out what our mistake was. What had happened was, we had been talking to Sloan, and we assumed that he had told the grand jury what he had told us. It turns out the prosecutors, who were really inept throughout all of Watergate, and that's putting it kindly, that the prosecutors had failed to ask him whether Haldeman was among those who controlled the fund. So it was a mistake of attribution, not of substance, but it cost us.
Well, in fairness to the prosecutors working on this case, they were working from the ground up, trying to indict the burglars and the people who supervised them, and at the same time, they were of the mindset that the White House Chief of Staff, the Attorney General involved in some sort of criminal conspiracy, they could not deal with that. And they did not, that was not where they were going. Where we were going was, hey, what happened here? This is a really strange event. And there were things that we had from people where you could, and there are very vivid scenes that reflect the reality of Carl and myself going to people knocking on their doors at night, and they were horrified. They were scared. All you have to see is that look on somebody's face, and that gives you more energy and suspicion than actually hard evidence.
Because you know there's something there.
Well, you say, why are people slamming the door?
And frightened.
A young woman named Judy Hoback, Carl Bernstein, who most Americans have never heard of.
She was the bookkeeper for the committee to re-elect the president and the assistant, really, to the treasurer of the campaign.
And her information was critical, wasn't it?
Her information. I went to see her, and again, this terrible fear. She didn't want to let me in the house. I got my foot in the door and began a conversation, and she didn't want me to take out a notebook, and I couldn't take notes. But what she eventually revealed in this conversation was that there was a slush fund in a safe that only the highest officials had access to, and that fund, she suspected, had something to do with Watergate.
We have to take a quick break. I want to ask you about Len Downey saying that Woodward and Bernstein were fighting all the time.
True.
A lot more coming up. Woodstein after this.
She says, look at this. What? Segretti crisscrossed the country at least a dozen times. He always stayed in cities where there are Democratic primaries.
Well, if the break-in was just one incident in a campaign of sabotage that began a whole year before Watergate,
then for the first time, the break-in makes sense. This isn't so crazy. This whole thing didn't start with the bugging of the headquarters. Segretti was doing this a year before the bugging.
and a year before, Nixon wasn't slaughtering Muskie, he was running behind Muskie. Told Muskie self-destruct.
Did you self-destruct?
You let Haldeman slip away.
Yes.
You've done worse than let Haldeman slip away, get people feeling sorry for him. I didn't think that was possible. In a conspiracy like this, you build from the outer edges and you go step by step. If you shoot too high and miss, everybody feels more secure. You put the investigation back months.
Yes, we know that. And if we're wrong, we're resigning. Were we wrong?
Bob Woodward, in the middle of the investigation, worrying, wondering, no one else covering the story. Was there a time where you said, this is really going nowhere? Journalistically, we better stop.
Well, not that we would stop, but we would resign, which Carl and I talked about. It turned out that it was a Haldeman operation, and as we very soon found out, and as the tapes revealed, and Haldeman's conviction, and finally Haldeman's memoir and Haldeman's diary showed that Nixon was regularly ordering all kinds of illegal activity, and that it was a mindset, that Watergate was not an isolated operation, but it was a part of a mosaic. And what we did is tapped into the mosaic, not just of Watergate, but of the dirty tricks.
Did you have to buck each other up? Downey says you fought like Cats and dogs? What did you fight about?
Well, we fought about what was appropriate to put in the paper, whether we had enough information to make an assertion or whether we did not. And we also fought with the editors. We fought over the wording of things. But I must say that very early on, we developed a kind of respect for each other and our respective skills, and could see that our work complemented each other. And I'm not sure that this story could have been covered by one person.
Oh, I agree with that, and it was in the Bradley area at the Post, they used to talk about creative tension, and there was creative tension between Carl and myself. But Carl had much more experience than I and taught me a great deal about pursuing records, going to the Library of Congress, cold calling almost anyone. Carl got somebody at the Post to get a list of everyone who worked at Nixon's re-election committee. That was a roadmap for us. Who should we go see, and so forth. And I mean, without, the sense, the firepower of how do you dig out a story and come up with the records was Carl, and Carl teaching me, we've got to do this, we need to go here. Carl had a kind of energy and a sense of this story is really big.
But he's also got a kind of directness. I'll sometimes work very circumlocutiously in questioning. Also, I think Bob correctly on many occasions said, wait a minute, we're not quite there yet. My instinct would be, let's go, let's go.
Deep Throat. Tell our audience again, Deep Throat. David Opes, your former literary agent, said, oh, this is a compilation of a whole lot of figures. You are insistent it is...
Deep Throat is one individual, exactly as we described in All the President's Men, someone who occupied a sensitive position in the executive branch of government. Obviously, there's great historical interest in his identity, and we're going to identify him upon his death, and
he has agreed that when he dies,
we're not going to get into
or when he releases us and allows us to do that. It will be a fascinating story, and it will be done. And Carl's absolutely right. There is a historical significance in this. We would like, when we wrote the book, we wanted to identify him as a source. Absolutely refused. Somebody, when it is revealed, in a sense, people say, now I see why and how this was done, and we are not going to break the agreement we had even this many years later.
With other sources as well. I mean, we went to every one of our sources when we wrote All the President's Men, and some, like you, Sloan, said, yes, you can use my name. Others, including Deep Throat, said, no, absolutely not.
We do know it's one person and a man.
One person and a man, exactly as
and you have taken some people out. Some people have come to you and said, please remove
Woodward had a bad day, and he said it wasn't Al Haig.
He ruled out Al Haig.
He ruled out Al Haig. I don't know why he ruled it. Because we've been very careful not to rule anyone out.
And we'll rule you out also, Tim. It was not you.
I'm worried about that one, I'll tell you. Social America. Carl, your son and your ex-wife are quoted as saying it was Mark Felt of the FBI.
Collectively, they have about as much knowledge as a man in the moon. That both Bob and I did one really smart thing in our coverage of Watergate. We did not tell either of our wives, now ex-wives, the identity of Deep Throat.
So who knows? Woodward and Bernstein and Ben Bradley. Later on, when did he find out?
Well, that's, Bradley knows, and there's been a full understanding of it. I think there are other people at the Washington Post who know or have very substantial suspicions. I think it's possible that Howard Simons, who is now deceased, who is the man